So, the reading for this week was roughly 45 pages, pages 1 through 45, from The Need for Roots. So, it starts off by saying that obligation comes before rights. And this is because obligation does not require recognition to be existent, but that right that goes unrecognized is not worth much. So, showing that obligation doesn't need that recognition in order to be self sufficient, but right does need that recognition in order to be acknowledged. And then it talks about how rights are related to conditions and obligations are independent of conditions. Like there's no conditions in order to meet your obligations in other senses. And it really dives into how the men of 1789, they didn't recognize a certain realm that involved that obligation over rights, and that's why we have the political and social confusion that we do now. And I found that quite intriguing because I've never put the two into perspective about how obligation is very important and how it needs to outweigh the rights. And I'm going to dive into that more because it hits a lot of things that need to be done in order to have a proper soul. And so I'm going to go ahead and go into that. So it talks about how the Egyptians believed that no soul could justify itself after death unless it could say, I have never let anyone suffer from hunger. So it uses this example and this analogy in order to make it a little more understandable throughout the reading and kind of connect it to hunger. It kind of stems off of how that's just hunger is the body level that you can see, and then there's more to it, the moral side as well. So on the body level, it's not just hunger, it's protecting against violence, housing, clothing, heating, hygiene, and medical things that people may need. But on the moral side of things, it's a little bit harder to recognize, but you can still see it. And it includes massacre, organized famine, enslavement on large scale, or enslavements, or even deportation, which is something that we're frequently seeing in the United States and a lot of us ignore. So it kind of opens a light to that as well, and why we have to shed a light on this because of certain aspects. And we'll dive into that in just a minute because I'm going to hit every key point that the reading hit, and it's a lot, but it is really worth listening to because really open my eyes and my hearts to many things, because it not only shows you what you need to have that soul and really be aware, self-aware, but it explains why. So first we're gonna dive into how first you need to identify the needs of the soul and the needs of the body. So you need to make sure you're identifying what really is a necessity rather than a desire or a whim or a fantasy. You really need to stop and just find the needs of the soul and the needs of the body, not your desires or what you think you need or your fantasies. And really need to distinguish necessities and luxuries, because you need to find what you really need rather than what is a luxury, because like it says, coal and fire is a luxury, heating is the main objective. So kind of getting to that point and really emphasizing that you need to distinguish between necessity and luxury. Then it dives into the good stuff. So first it talks about how order is the main food of the body, or necessarily the soul. It says, whoever acts in such a way as to increase this incompatibility is a troublemaker. Whoever acts in such a way as to diminish it is an agent of order. Whoever, so as to simplify problems, denies the existence of certain obligations has in his heart made a compact with crime. So basically saying that whoever increases incompatibility to order is a troublemaker. And then whoever acts to diminish that incompatibility is actually an agent of order and is trying to establish order in such a sense. And then whoever so as to simplify problems, denies the existence of certain obligations. So basically, denying the obligations that you have to society. Well, not necessarily society, because let's make it clear that obligations are to oneself, and that's what makes an obligation important, is that you can't have obligations to a collective. So that's the important part of this article, because it really hits on oneself and then eventually goes to that collective aspect. But that's what makes the soul really, really important, is that disconnection from the collective. So but by ignoring it and acting like it's not there, it's really a compact crime. Next, we go into liberty, which is the ability to choose. And it really talks about rules, how they should be stable in general and limited in number, because the person needs to be able to accurately understand what the rules are, and not have to question every single decision they make. It shouldn't be something that is so strict that it's hard to follow. It should be something that's sustainable and stable and able to be understood easily. It basically states that if the rules are too harsh, that they're gonna think that liberty is not a good thing, because they're not going to get enjoyment out of it, because they're going to have the ability to choose, but the choice is going to be so complicated to make that they're going to think that liberty is a bad thing, and it's not. So you have to balance rules in order to be able to get that good outcome of liberty. Next, we go into obedience, and there's two kinds. Obedience to establish rules, and obedience to human beings looked upon as leaders. So basically realizing that obedience under the rules, and that goes into the liberty aspect of things, and then how the hierarchy, which is the leaders, should be obedient as well, in a sense that they should be looking at the common goal as well, and how basically it should be felt from highest to lowest. It shouldn't be like highs up here and that's it, and lows down here, that's it. No, it should be felt everywhere. Next is responsibility. Obedience. Going back to obedience, we really need to focus on how when a society is ruled by one man, it's out of hands of a sick man, and that's because you're not having those multiple like the order isn't being kept in the right sense. And basically it says that a ruler should not be like a dictator, but rather be a symbol, and a symbol of all of the things that they need to be. Next, we go into responsibility, basically saying, which I found very intriguing, is that you can give a man food and clothing and shelter and everything, but you need to give them a purpose, which is their responsibility. They need to feel responsible for something. So you may give them everything in the world, but they need that sense of responsibility in order to feed one's soul and feel a sense of actually being something of importance. So I found that quite intriguing, that you need to have that sense of responsibility in order to feel that soul, to feel it. Next, we talk about equality. This one was really, really long, and I'm just going to take out parts that I found quite intriguing, in the sense that it said, for a man who occupies an inferior position and suffers from it, to know that his position is a result of his incapacity, and that everyone is aware of the fact, is not any consolation, but an additional motive of bitterness. So basically saying that because of the sense of inequality, it could potentially become bitter and therefore hinder everyone else. So there needs to be a sense of proportion, and that can be defined as the combination of equality with inequality. So basically you need to be able to make it proportional in order to make it prosper, and basically just make a balance in order to make it prosper. So it needs to be equal in the sense of making inequality and equality equal, which I found quite intriguing because it makes sense that you have to make a balance out of it. So it was quite intriguing to read about. And it basically just means that you need to honor each human condition with those marks of respect which are proper to it and are not just a hollow pretense. So basically treat everyone equally rather than treating someone lesser than yourself. If we treat everyone equally, no matter their social class or their race or their sexual orientation, whatever the case may be, then that respect is going to be felt equally and thus have a better outcome. Then we talk about hierarchyism. I'm just going to say hierarchy. Basically going back to what has already been stated, that those people in power need to be symbols and not try to be rulers in a sense. They rather need to be symbols of prosperity and other things like that. Next, we go into honor, and basically just saying that we need to recognize and share in the traditions and not forget them, and honor what people have done in the past in order to keep them alive and really honor the things that were done well and good. Next talks about punishment. There's disciplinary punishment and penal punishment, basically talking about how anyone who commits a crime needs to be subject to it, just like anyone who has an honor needs to be subject to it. When you don't hold someone accountable for their crime, then they lose themselves and lose their soul. So that's why punishment is important in this, in order to feed a soul. Basically kind of talks about how penal is a pressure through fear, and that's not necessarily a good thing, because punishment must be an honor. So it must be an honor in order to be a good punishment, because they need to be honored that they're... It's hard to explain, but I'm going to do my best. They need to be honored that they're being punished because they mean something in a sense, but their crime is not a great thing, but they need that punishment to be an honor in order to re-enter their soul and re-enter it in a right form. So that was intriguing to read, and it was a little confusing at first, so I reread it and it made sense. So sorry if my explanation of it isn't really clear, but basically just means that everyone needs to be punished for their crime, no matter how small or little, but it needs to be equivalent to what the crime is. And I think that's the problem with our society, is that our judiciary system is completely corrupt, and people are being punished for crimes that are super tiny for a long time, and people that are committing murder or acts of horrendous things are being punished for little time, or for certain mental incompatibility or mental illnesses that their lawyers bring about. So I think it needs to be made a point that we need to go back to this in feeding the soul, that the punishment needs to be equivalent to what the crime is, in order to make sure that the punishment is done in honor. Then freedom of opinion. Freedom of opinion was quite a long read and very intriguing. I'm going to pick out the pieces that were the most important in my eyes. It talks about how freedom of opinion and freedom of association is sometimes confused, and that it does not need to be, because association is not a need, so it's not something that needs to be fed by the soul. Opinion is really needed for intelligence, and there's 3 ways you can do that. Is the technical, which is basically following the way things are done, provided light, kind of giving more insight, and operating alone. So kind of dives into each of those in their own areas, but what I found intriguing later on was how it talks about how destroying political parties is going to be a key aspect into really feeding the soul, because collective intelligence, it says that collective intelligence, that's not there's no such thing as a collective intelligence. Everyone needs to have their individual thoughts, and by having these political parties and feeding these thoughts and these beliefs, you're not allowing people to feed their souls in the proper way. So I found that intriguing in a sense, because then it went to say that we all know, besides that, the rival teams in the United States are not political parties. That kind of confused me a little bit because I do see our Republican Party and Democratic Party as parties because they have their particular beliefs, which they set on to the people that are in them. And so I think that kind of stems into how that collective intelligence is kind of being forced upon them. So it's taking away from their soul value and taking away from feeding their soul. So I was a little confused with that. But it was something that I would like to dig deeper in and really talk about later. And then it talks about how without freedom there's no thought. So if we don't have the freedom to think, if there's no freedom, there's no thought. If we don't have that freedom, then we're going to be told to think a certain way, and there is no thought in doing that. So it really talks about that. Next is security. Basically, security is that your soul is not under fear or terror under long periods of time, or basically just not fear or terror. And then it goes back again to the Egyptians. I think this is really cool how it really digs into the Egyptians. As a kid, I really loved reading things about the Egyptian culture and Roman gods and things like that. So this is really intriguing. Talked about how the Egyptians said, the just man should be able to say after the death, I never caused anyone any fear. So it really talks about how we need to be able to give security to one another, but security within ourselves and our soul as well. The next thing was risk. Basically, with the absence of risk comes boredom. When there's boredom, it just weakens a lot of things, including courage. When there's no risk, there's no courage involved because you're not risking anything, so you don't need to be courageous. Next is private property, and collective property were the next things, and those two were a little confusing to me as well, but I'm going to try to explain to my best of my ability. It just basically said that private property, it is wasted. Basically it said, like, if there's a gardener, that eventually he's going to want to own the land that he's gardening, and he said it basically means like he's going to think that land is his eventually. So it says that basically if land is not like doesn't have that ownership, it is wasted, not from the point of view of corn production, but from that of the satisfaction of the property need which it could produce. So basically it's saying that the person needs that property to fill that value, and it's basically being wasted because it's not giving that value to that person. Yes, it's producing. Yes, it has those needs and it's producing for that money aspect, but it's not necessarily producing for the soul, so it's wasted. Next, it talks about collective property, which confused me because a lot of this has to do with not being on a collective level, but I think I understand where they're going with this in the same sense that it says any form of possession which does not satisfy someone's need of private or collective property can reasonably be regarded as useless. So basically saying that even though it's private or collective, it needs to have a purpose into somebody's soul in order to be of use. If it's not doing that, whether it's collective or private, it's not meeting its use or its full potential. So yeah, I think that's where they're going with that. And I think it's cool. They say, but rather to try and turn it into something genuine form of property. Turn it into some genuine form of property. So basically try to turn it into something that's actually going to feed someone's soul rather than just a collective of making corn or something. Turn it into someone's purpose and give them a reason to be there and feed someone's soul. Lastly is truth, and it says that truth is the more sacred than any other need, and that it's often ignored because it's hard to accept the truth sometimes, and it's hard to even see the truth sometimes, especially with our day and age. It really talks about the press and the newspaper and how many things are misconstrued throughout our generation. So how truth is a really important thing, but sometimes is hard to see or is hard to accept in many cases. And talks about how truth really it goes back to crime sometimes, that if someone, whether it's a small lie or not, it still needs to have that punishment. They need to be able, and one of the examples they used was if someone lies in like a newspaper or something, going straight to the court rather than just telling them or going to the editor, just go straight to the court. The issue with that was being, how are you going to find a court that is particularly going to hold on to the truth and really fight for the truth? So they stated that there is no possible chance of satisfying a people's need of truth unless men can be found for the purpose who love truth. So basically, people need to love truth, and the purpose of love, and the purpose to gather thoughts, unless men can be found for this purpose who love truth. So what it was saying is that the purpose of the court is to find the truth. So they need to find people who love the truth in order to find that truth. So that was quite intriguing as well. Then the next few pages, I believe I needed to read. It was the end of the need for roots, but this one goes to uprootedness, and this I think is really important because it really flows into what unroots people and how that unrootedness can bring bitter to everyone, basically. So to be rooted is perhaps the most important and least recognized need of the human soul. It is one of the hardest to define. That's what they stated. So basically meaning that we need to have roots, and it's super important to have roots and recognize them, because that's what feeds our soul and feeds our purpose. And it's really hard to define your roots sometimes, because sometimes we don't know where we come from, or we don't know where we stem from, so our roots can be hard to define. So basically our roots, they're brought to us about place, conditions of birth, profession, and social surroundings. Like, things you can't avoid are your roots. And sometimes being uprooted can stem from lacking of truth. You don't want to be true to who you are, or you don't like where your roots came from, or you don't like where your roots may lead. So you're uprooted from your actual roots, and that's where the problems stem from. And then the spreading of this disease of not understanding and being uprooted, it comes from two factors. One of them is money, of course, and the other is education. So money basically, it just destroys everything when it can get into someone's mind and soul, because it becomes a desire, and most of the time is the one thing people are working towards, whether it should be or not. It's what people usually work towards, especially in our society. We're told from a young age, get a good job so you can make good money. No matter where you come from, get a good job so you can make money. And that's the American dream, right? Make something of yourself. So honestly, it's funny when I talk to my grandparents, the American dream is to be happy and be successful in your own way. But in my eyes, the American dream, from what I was taught, even in school, is that the American dream is to be successful, make a lot of money. That's just what everyone's working towards. We want to be rich, and not rich in the soul, but rich in the pocket. So I think that's where the uprootedness comes from, and I think that's where our bitterness as a society comes from as well. And this reading helped me realize that a lot of our issues stem in money, and of course that would be the first factor in the spreading of the disease of being uprooted and really bitter and not feeding one's soul. So it's sad that it took reading this to know that. I know money is usually the stem of all problems, but reading it and really taking it in makes it a little bit different. And then it states that it easily manages to outweigh all other motives, because the effort it demands of the mind is so very much less. Nothing is so clear and so simple as a row of figures. So everything I stated before, like I said, sometimes it's confusing to understand. I'm in college, and you think it would be easier to understand everything that I've read and being able to key it in. But some of these things are still a little bit hard to understand. Like I said, private property, collective property, it's hard to grasp onto. It makes sense, yes, but it's hard to grasp onto. So yes, of course money is going to be easier. It's easier, like I said, especially as a business major. I'm an accountant. I went into accounting because numbers don't lie. I like answers. I like concise answers. I like to know the answers and always have the answers. I don't like the what ifs. So yeah, I went to where money doesn't lie, and I see that now is that it is clear and it is very simple. Accounting itself, the rules and procedures aren't simple, but the math and the numbers are. That's why I love it. The numbers come easily to me, and that's just because it's easy to see where the money's flowing, because that's how we make it. Money's easy to read. So it kind of makes sense, or it does make sense, that finding, or especially as an accountant, that money is easy, because it is. But sometimes really stopping and thinking, and what I do is, and what I is what I am is what really stopping and thinking what I'm trying to accomplish. Does it have order? Does it acquire liberty? Does it have obedience, responsibility, equality, that hierarchy chain, honor, punishment if needed, freedom of opinion, security, risk, private property, collective property, and most importantly, truth? And really stopping to think about all of those things is harder than just looking at the money and seeing the figures. So that makes sense. And then the next one is education. And at first I thought, oh, well, it's just the lack of education that is in our school system. But that's not the case. It's basically saying that the desire to learn for the sake of learning, the desire for truth, has become very rare. Honestly, that is the truth. My objective in college is to learn to get a degree. Or at least that's what it was. Now that I've taken honor courses, especially Tutorial 1 with Professor Gold, my whole perspective of the world and what my end goal has changed. Professor Gold has helped me see that I really want to make an impact on addiction and hunger, especially in the homeless communities and mental illness, and she's helped me see that. So I believe that she's helping feed my soul in a way, if you can say that. I find her as a mentor, and she's really helped me see that my end goal in college is not necessarily to get a degree. I mean, yes, of course, get the degree, but my true end goal is to become a better person and be able to help other people at the end of the day. So I thank her for that. But it is true that the desire for truth is very rare. The easy answers are easy, so why dig deeper if that takes more work? And I can see where that problem lies. And next, it talks about how people who don't get specific jobs and are fed in their heads that they didn't get it because they weren't smart enough or intelligent enough to get it, that can make them very bitter and uproot them in themselves, not be proud of where they came from, not be proud of who they are, and that uproots them in themselves. So our society telling someone, well, you can't go to school because you don't have the money because your parents weren't smart enough to make the money, that uproots somebody. And whoever is uprooted himself uproots others. Whoever is rooted himself doesn't uproot others. That's what the article stated. That was one of the last things that was in page 45, and it really hit me when it said that, because it's true. When someone's bitter, it can drag down people, but when people are spreading happiness, it's contagious. It's people's attitudes and demeanors are contagious. So if you're spreading happiness and joy, that's contagious. If you're spreading bitterness and despair, that's contagious. So it really hit me hard in the sense that when we tell people they can't do something because of where they come from or who they are, or who their parents are, what color they are, because what they choose to be, or what gender they are, or whatever the case may be. We're uprooting them and taking away the truth. And the truth is, they can do whatever they set their minds to. We're taking away their liberty, their ability to choose, because we're taking away their sense of order. They don't see order. They don't see the order in being told that they're not able to do anything. That is the order, to the lowest point of the chain. So that is the order to them. So we really need to take a step back and strive for the truth and want to learn and be hungry to learn. Because when we do that, we're going to spread that joy of learning again, the joy of actually finding the truth and learning and making a difference in the world, rather than just striving to be rich. And a lot of the time, even when you're rich, you're not necessarily happy. So not to be rich in your pockets, but rather be rich in your soul. Thank you.